They say when recording podcasts, you're meant to record 5 and then release the 6th. By then, you have a general understanding of the flow and format of your podcast, and you're just ready to release it into the world. I have not done this, so I apologize for how rough this may seem, but I promise with time I will get better at this. Please be patient. Thanks for tuning in. Close your eyes and open your mind. I'm your host Michael, and welcome to This Strange Void. Hey guys, and welcome back to the show. This is episode 2. If you didn't listen to the last episode, shame on you. Go back and listen to it now. I'm just kidding, but please do go back and listen. If you did, thank you, and welcome back to This Strange Void. I'm so excited to be back and talking about another topic of the strange and unusual. Today we will be exploring the subject of vampires, and I'll share a couple of stories. A vampire is a creature birthed from folklore that exists by feeding on the blood of the living. The story of Sekhmet, the Egyptian feline warrior goddess associated with both plague and healing, is considered by some to be one of the oldest vampire tales. Legend holds that the sun god Ra sent his daughter Sekhmet down to punish humankind for their disobedience, but after Sekhmet couldn't stop drinking blood amid her slaughter, Ra quelled her planet-draining thirst by dyeing a bunch of beer red. So basically she guzzled it all and slept for 3 days. Lilith, a 4,000-year-old figure in Jewish folklore who in some stories was Adam's first wife before Eve, had a monstrous reputation in ancient Babylonia. Her name derives from a Sumerian word for female demons or wind spirits, Lilitu. According to scholar J.A. Skurlock, the Babylonians believed Lilitu were hungry for victims because they had once been human, and slipped through windows into people's houses looking for victims to take place of the husbands and wives whom they themselves never had. In early European folklore, vampires are the undead that often visited loved ones and caused mischief or even deaths in the neighborhoods they inhabited while they were alive. They wore shrouds and were often described as bloated and of ruddy or dark appearance, quite different from today's gaunt, pale vampire, which dates from the early 19th century. Vampiric entities have been recorded in cultures from around the world. The term vampire was popularized in Western Europe after reports of an 18th century mass hysteria of a pre-existing folk belief in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, that in some cases resulted in corpses being staked and people being accused of vampirism. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by English writer John Pilidori. The story was highly successful and arguably the most influential vampire work of the early 19th century. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis of the modern vampire legend. The success of the book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century, with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. We have all grown up with the understanding that vampires can transform into bats and fly around at night in search for their feast of precious blood, but as long as there's garlic involved, the beast shall not feast. I feel like I consume enough garlic to fend off any undead creature of the night. So let's get started with the story, shall we? There's a fascinating and suggestive tale from the history of New Orleans, believed to be one of America's most haunted cities. Let's take a glance back into the year 1932. A young girl storms down Royal Street, visibly in shock, her movement broken only by the interception of a police officer. Her story sounded a bit far-fetched. She claimed to be tied up by 2 brothers along with several other victims and held captive so the brothers could drink their blood. The girl claimed that she was only able to escape due to her captor's carelessness in securing her ropes. Police, still somewhat skeptical, still agreed to follow her back to the home on the corner of Royal and St. Anne. Once they had arrived at the home owned by the Carter brothers, they were horrified to find that, as the girl had described, there were 4 other victims half dead, tied to chairs in one of the rooms. All of the victims had their wrists wrapped with bandages, moist and stained with blood. They also found that 2 more bodies wrapped in blankets were tucked away in yet another room. The pungent smell of death permeated the air. It seemed the brothers left early each morning just before daybreak and returned every evening just after dark. Upon their return, they would take the bandages off each of the captives' wrists and, using a knife, reopen the wounds until blood flowed freely from the victims' cuts. They caught the blood in cups from which they drank until their hunger was satisfied. The brothers would then redress the wounds with fresh bandages. They spoke very little and gave no concern for their victims' well-being. It seemed the kidnapped were no more than a food source headed for certain death. Unaware that the girl had escaped, John and Wayne Carter went about their routine as usual. Only this time the police waited for the brothers to return. They were quickly apprehended and upon their capture confessed almost immediately, begging to be killed. The brothers explained to the authorities that they were, in fact, vampires and would, if released, have no other option but to continue to kill. Their need for blood was beyond their control. The brothers explained to the authorities that they were, in fact, vampires and would, if released, have no other option but to continue to kill, as their need for drinking blood was beyond their control. It said the brothers were tried as serial killers, convicted, and eventually executed. How is it that the brothers, thinking themselves vampires gifted with eternal life, could be so careless with their plans for survival? Perhaps it was the drastic changing environment of New Orleans that ultimately led to their demise. In May of 1866, a whaling bark named the Atlantic set sail from the port of Boston on a 2-year journey amidst the Indian Ocean. She was a vessel of significant size and carried a crew totaling 38 sailors, for whom the majority were migrant workers who had joined at various stages of previous voyages. Including these men was a 25-year-old Guyanan national named James Brown. Brown had enlisted as the cook aboard the Atlantic and had gained a reputation for being easily tempered. He had been warned repeatedly about his behaviour by the ship's captain Benjamin Wing, as his constant bickering and fighting with other crew members was proving difficult to diffuse on such lengthy voyages. Not long into the journey, Brown came into conflict once again, this time with a 19-year-old mate by the name of James Foster. As he was being restrained by the rest of the crew, Brown claimed that Foster had used a racial slur against him. Foster denied this allegation though. As time passed and Brown seemed to have calmed, he reluctantly resumed his duties in the galley. The following morning, Foster did not report for his watch, which then called for a search of the vessel. A short time later, Brown was found crouched behind some crates in the darkness of the vessel's holds by another ship's mate named James Gardner. Underneath him were the mutilated remains of Foster. The dead man's remains were covered in deep lacerations, seemingly to be inflicted by a whaling knife wielded by Brown. The cook was crouched down on all fours, lapping up blood that had pooled on the deck. Gardner immediately cried out in horror, drawing the attention of more crew members to the bloody scene, who were then able to incapacitate and restrain the murderer. A cursory check of the corpse found it had been completely drained of blood as a result of the deep and vicious knife wounds inflicted upon it. Worse still, there was a second body found a short distance away, similarly drained of blood. Hissing and lashing out at anybody who tried to communicate with him, seemingly to be possessed by the devil, Brown was clapped in irons and thrown into the brig until a vessel could return him and the witnesses back to Boston for his trial. On November 13th, he was found guilty of the 2 murders and sentenced to death. In a bizarre twist of fate, Brown would be saved by the gallows by none other than the President of the United States himself, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson had assumed the presidency following the death of Abraham Lincoln, and was notorious for this sympathy towards those who had been given the death penalty. As a result, Brown's sentence was changed to a life of imprisonment. Rescued from the gallows, Brown was transferred to the Charleston State Prison, a bleak and abusive facility located on a 5-acre plot between Austin and Washington streets, near where Bunker Hill Community College is today. Considered a vile and unpredictable inmate, in 1873 he allegedly stabbed another prisoner 7 times in an apparent attempt to drain him of his blood. relegating him to isolation for 12 years with only the keeper and the physician for human contact. Brown was formally declared insane in June 1885, probably from the 12 years of isolation, and transferred to St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. The June 26 Boston Globe reported that while at Charleston, Brown had committed no less than 26 murderous assaults on his fellow prisoners and officers of the prison, despite the fact that he was supposedly segregated from other prisoners most of the time. In 1882, Brown was found hunched over the lifeless corpse of one of his guards. He had apparently murdered the jailer with a broken chair leg and was repeatedly tearing away with his teeth at a jagged wound he had inflicted on the dead man's throat. Brown died 3 years later. The majority of his crewmates had already perished when the Atlantic was wrecked off of the coast of San Francisco during an almighty storm, which some commentators have noted may have served as the inspiration for the arrival of Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. George and Mary Brown, no relation to James, were well-respected farmers with no reason for anyone to suspect that they and their 3 children were anything but a normal Rhode Island family. But disaster struck the family in 1883 when Mary died of consumption, followed by their eldest daughter Mary Olive in 1888. In 1890 their son Edwin became ill, then the youngest, a 19-year-old lady named Mercy, died in 1892, leaving only George and his dying son. Terrified from the symptoms, now believed to be tuberculosis, the neighbors started to fear that the Browns' illness was caused by vampires. In an attempt to verify their suspicions, on the morning of March 17, 1892, the bodies of Mary and Mary Olive were exhumed, and it was determined that due to their natural decomposition, neither was a vampire. But when they dug up Mercy's body, they found her not only in excellent condition, but in a very different position than that from which she was buried. Most significantly, her heart was perfectly preserved and filled with blood. Dug up, it's not really the proper term though, because Mercy's body was actually not buried, but kept above ground in a crypt, due to the ground being frozen. Therefore, it is speculated that the cold weather kept her body better preserved. Nevertheless, common sense never seemed to sway a 19th century mob, and they believed this uncorruption as evidence of vampirism. They supposedly removed Mercy's heart and burned it on a nearby rock. The ashes were mixed with water and given to Edwin to drink to ward off his vampire sister Mercy from returning from the grave to further inflict him. The ritual, it failed, of course, and Edwin died 2 months later. Still, there was no explanation for why Mercy was in a different position in her casket, unless she wasn't dead when she was buried, or someone just made it up. She was reburied in Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. Interestingly, an account published in the Alexandria Gazette on March 21st, 1892, reported nothing amiss with Mercy's body when it was examined. A Dr. Metcalf reported the body was in a natural state of decomposition with nothing exceptional existing, and when the doctor removed the heart and liver, a quantity of blood was found. But this is, he said, was just what might be expected. The report does go on to say, however, that Mercy's heart and liver were cremated, with no explanation why. Hey guys, so that wraps up another episode. I just want to say thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's topic. I had a few more stories that I wanted to share, so we may even do a second part to this later down the line. No promises, but hopefully. Unless I get distracted and find something else. If you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, like us on Spotify or whatever, or even just share with someone you may think might be interested in the podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. You can write in and tell me your stories or even suggestions about topics you'd like to hear about. You can contact me at thisstrangevoid@gmail.com or even DM me on Instagram at thisstrangevoid. We'll be going out again from another track from my friend Moso. You can find a link to his SoundCloud in the show notes. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.